The New Orleans Saints simply must come to terms with the fact that their offense is in disarray from several different angles and get it fixed, because finger pointing isn't going to get them anywhere. We got all that and a little bit of lanyard for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome in to another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to all you everydayers out there making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget you can subscribe and follow always for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss the latest episodes. And if you want to keep the conversation going, take part in our exclusive film studies, Q&As, early access, insider information, and so much more. You can become a Locked On Saints insider by heading over to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnSaints today to join a community I would love for you to be a part of. As always, I am your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on your favorite social media, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media. You can find me every single day over at Saints News Network, Tuesdays on the Locked On NFL podcast, and here with you every single Monday through Friday, and then some on Locked On Saints. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends at FanDuel, FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can put down just $5 and get $200 in bonus bets by heading over to FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're going to be taking a look at a couple different things here. I want to go all the way ahead to the end of the season. Is there a busy off season on the way for the New Orleans Saints? I'm going to tell you why I think that there will be and why I think it starts almost all the way at the top. We're also going to be taking a look at what we learned from watching other NFL teams play on the offensive side of the football this weekend. What did we learn from offenses that are good, that look good? What did we learn from offenses that are good, that didn't look as good? We're going to break all of that down and how the New Orleans Saints could improve based on some of that information. But first, I want to dive into this quick conversation here around finger pointing. That finger pointing is not working for the New Orleans Saints, and it's not something that they should themselves take part in. Now, look, if you're a fan, if you're a media person, all that stuff, finger pointing's convenient, right? I mean, it's one of those things where you can kind of give yourself a sense of relief by pointing at one thing and saying that's the whole issue. If they fix that one thing, then bam, they're going to be fine. It's convenient. It's nice. It creates a sense of relief, creates a sense of control, right? It's one thing, get that one thing fixed and it'll do it. Well, for me, in the way that I've always kind of looked at this for the New Orleans Saints, and I hope that the way that the Saints are looking at it as well, is that it's not just one thing, one player, one coach, one whatever. It's a lot. It's nearly everything. Derek Carr is not playing well, right? Not making good decisions on the field. Great. Does that mean that you have to specifically focus in on Derek Carr? No, because you also have effort concerns around the offense. A whole lot's been made of Chris Olave on a 3rd and 5 on a route that should have never been thrown to him in the first place. And we're still not necessarily completely sure was actually thrown to him, more than it was that the clear out didn't happen quick enough. And then Derek Carr, instead of waiting to take, Taysom Hill or take the two backside reads, he just threw the pass away. In either case, neither one of those things is acceptable. Offensive line struggles for this team, play calling and play design issues for this team, coaching issues for this team, which are seen and illustrated through some of the effort concerns, some of the bad decision making, things like that. This New Orleans Saints offense, oh, and by the way, no run game too. So this New Orleans Saints offense has a lot wrong with it, right? It's not just one thing that you can neatly point to and say, well, if they fix that one thing, then all of a sudden it's there. Everything's going to come down to the quarterback. Everything's going to come down to the offensive coordinator. Everything's going to come down to the head coach, of course. And I understand that, because one of the things that, just to give a little bit of an idea of what we're going to be discussing here in the second segment, what we saw a lot of in the NFL this past weekend was quarterbacks making plays when plays broke down. And we don't see that from Derek Carr. We don't see that from the New Orleans Saints. So everything has been disappointing. Just about. Everything's been disappointing, except for kind of the record. 3-4 in this division keeps you in the conversation. I had the Saints through their first 7 games going 4-3, and in losing to the Indianapolis Colts, back-to-back losses between them and the Jaguars, to be 4-4 by the end of next weekend. And so if the Saints go out and then they win in Indianapolis, because I predicted them to lose with Anthony Richardson at quarterback, if they go out there and win with Gardner Minshew at quarterback, then all of a sudden they're 4-4 and they're simply what we expected in that case. So as a whole, there's still something salvageable here, but you have got to get things going. And whether that's the quarterback and the receivers not being on the same page, which is a coaching issue, by the way, in my opinion. If there's effort issues, coaching. If there's a quarterback that's making bad decisions and is allowed to go out there and continue to make bad decisions, coaching. All of those things come down to the leaders of your team. And that's where I think that this New Orleans Saints team needs to be looking at itself in the mirror, is understanding that there's a myriad of things that are wrong with this offense, and it's up to coaching, players, everybody to get it fixed. And that sitting around and finger pointing is not going to get it done. Dennis Allen, in his conference call with us on Friday, mentioned that Chris Olave didn't run that route, the one that everybody's talking about on the 3rd and 5, go route, the clear out route that he ran, all those things. Mentioned that that Chris Olave didn't run the route the way it was supposed to be run, and that Derek Carr liked the one-on-one on the outside, but never really talked about the fact that Derek Carr, under very, very, very unusual circumstances, should not like the one-on-one on the outside, and that he should very much like the underneath route that Taysom Hill was running, or one of the two backside routes, which is what Michael Thomas took to social media to clarify as well and kind of stand up for Chris Olave, which I loved seeing. And so this is just another example of where finger pointing doesn't work. Don't single anybody out. Here's what we thought we saw on the play. Here's what wasn't there, and here are the things that accounted for that thing not working out. Be more all-encompassing with the way that you address some of these things. And I think that we have to do the same thing. We can't just look at a team and say, okay, well, this player didn't do this on this play, therefore it didn't work. No, there's a whole other team on the field. And there's the rest of that player's team on the field that could also be doing something that's not working out. And in many cases, that is the case for the New Orleans Saints offense, to where there are shortcomings on several different areas of the field. There are shortcomings at several different positions, shortcomings at several different players, however it is that you want to look at it. So really what the Saints need to be focused on is, how do they fix their offense? How do they get this offense to look like what they want it to look like and produce the way that they want it to produce, and to be an offense that belongs in the modern day NFL era? Because right now, the New Orleans Saints offense does not belong here in 2023. It's not working. And so something has to change. And that, to me, is paramount. First, foremost, end all, be all, however it is that you want to describe it. To me, that is the most important aspect. Because if you get an offense out there that's executing, that's putting their players in the best position to execute and do well, and that's catering to the talent that you have on this team, then all of a sudden buy-in is not an issue. Bad decision-making gets kind of quelled because you have a lot of right decisions to make, because you're able to identify things before the snap happens, whatever that might be. Effort concerns go away. Everything changes if you put together an offense that actually showcases this team as opposed to holds it back. So the fact of the matter is that you can point your fingers, if you're the New Orleans Saints, at your quarterback, at Derek Carr. You can point your fingers at Chris Olave. You can point your fingers back at yourselves in terms of your offensive system. The fact of the matter is that the real situation is that all of those things are true. All of those things are a problem, all at the same time. And it's on one spot to get that fixed. And that's eventually going to fall on Dennis Allen. Coming up next, what did we see around the New Orleans, or rather outside of the New Orleans Saints, around the NFL on offense that could potentially help the New Orleans Saints? We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at eBay Motors. eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer to bring you the best fantasy football advice here every single week, all season long. So whether you're getting ready for your daily fantasy drafts, or maybe you're scouring that free agency pool to see if you can get a little bit of an addition, or maybe the waiver wire for an addition to go into your next week, we're going to be giving you the players that are going to be a guaranteed fit for your roster. So let's see who Vinny has chosen for this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit fantasy pick of the week. And this one, you might agree with, you might disagree with. This one's going to be really interesting. Saints quarterback, Derek Carr. Now, look, he hasn't been the promising player that he was expected to be this season in reality or for fantasy football, but with all of his new wide receivers and all that, there is a path for Derek Carr to put up some pleasing starting numbers against the Indianapolis Colts in week 8. Now, they've been able, the Indianapolis Colts, to contain the run well at times, but as you saw against the Cleveland Browns, the secondary is very, very weak, and the pass rush is very inconsistent there as well. So with the work of receivers like Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed and Michael Thomas winning their matchups, Carr could have his best day as a downfield passer so far this season, adding up to a sneaky good start in fantasy football, whether you're looking at a deep league streamer or a DFS tournament play. So Vinny Iyer over at Locked On Fantasy Football is here to help you win your fantasy football championships, and eBay Motors knows that a championship team is all about players being the perfect fit, and the same goes for your vehicle. With over 122 million parts and accessories for your number one ride or die, you can make sure that your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, whatever it is that your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. So keep your ride or die alive today at ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit available only to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. What did we see in a stress-free weekend around the NFL that could potentially aid the New Orleans Saints, particularly on the offensive side of the football, but also situationally as well? Appreciate everybody for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Big shout out to you everydayers out there. So I want to start off with, I have an offense that performed well, that is good, that the New Orleans Saints can learn from. An offense that usually performs well, didn't perform well, that the New Orleans Saints can learn from. And then, of course, we'll take a look at the impact of the Atlanta Falcons beating the Tampa Bay Buccaneers on that game-winning field goal by Younghoe Koo, and something else that could potentially aid the Saints there. So let's start off with the offense that performed well, that has looked good, and that would be the Todd Monken called, Lamar Jackson quarterbacked, Harbaugh-led Baltimore Ravens. Baltimore Ravens going up against the Detroit Lions in what ended up being a wholly lopsided victory, wholly as in W-H-O-L-L-Y, lopsided victory in this one. But the thing that you saw in this game that worked for the Baltimore Ravens that I think could be really interesting for the New Orleans Saints is actually a little bit of the QB run situation. Now, I'm not talking about this with Derek Carr. I'm actually talking about this with Taysom Hill. What we see with Taysom Hill as a runner a lot are these QB powers, right? Every now and then they'll run a QB sweep over to the outside on the opposite side and things like that. But you see a lot of powers running up the middle, things like that. But if you ask me, I tend to think that Taysom Hill has the athleticism and the speed to be able to win on the perimeter as well. So if you look at Lamar Jackson's first touchdown, which was in the red zone, they ran motion from the play side to the back side, right? Considering where he's running, being the play side, which is the left side of the offense. They ran motion from the left side to the right, took the snap, had the play action go right up the middle, right there, which collapsed that defense a little bit. And then Lamar Jackson on the rollout got to the outside perimeter and was able to walk into the end zone effectively. Now, I don't think that play works 100% of the time, of course, and things like that. In fact, we know it doesn't. But I am curious about Taysom Hill's ability to be able to run some plays like that, to where you fake the rollout with him and then eventually actually have him take off on a perimeter run as opposed to up the middle. Now, do I mention that because Taysom Hill's doing a bad job rushing up the middle? No, absolutely not. But I do think that variety and maybe adding another counterpunch to the Taysom Hill play sheet makes a lot of sense. Now, I don't know that you're adding plays at this point in your season, but if you're desperate enough, which New Orleans Saints absolutely should be, considering how porous their offense has been so far, you absolutely should be looking at opportunities to add stuff. So I am curious about that. But it also brings me to another larger point that more so applies to Derek Carr. Where are the moving pockets, the rollouts on the play actions and things like that? I mean, we only see about 7 or 8 at most play action plays run by this offense all told, which already tells you that it's dated and that it's stale and that it lacks creativity, it lacks imagination. But if they were to add more of that, run more play action, include, things that happen in 2023's NFL into their offense, then it would also add opportunities to be able to move the pocket and get some of those rollouts. One of the things that we've noticed about the New Orleans Saints is that when they have their starting offensive line in, they seem to be, I don't know what it is, but the communication's not there, the blocking's not there, whatever it might be. So as their offensive line gets back to healthy, right, and you hope to get Ryan Ramczyk back, you hope to get James Hurst back, if there's further concerns around the offensive line as a whole, which, by the way, I want to give a lot of credit to Cam Erving and Max Garcia, who played remarkably well, especially Cam Erving, who had just joined the team the week before and looked really, really good. So that worked out well. But the play action rollouts, all these things that kind of get this offense moving, get Derek Carr on the move, buy him some time, buy him some space from the pass rushers, and create a little bit of run and catch football, a little bit of that backyard football. Think Kansas City Chiefs, not to the point to where Patrick Mahomes is making magic in the backfield, but just the simple play action rollout to where you have a route or two that's crossing over from one side of the field to the same side of the field that you're bringing that QB motion. And then you have players running away from defenders as opposed to running upfield, right? So that you're moving laterally gives you opportunities to attack more over the middle of the field. Or if you feel more comfortable with the perimeter, which has kind of been the focus of the New Orleans Saints offense to very little success so far this season, at least having the crossing routes to where you have depth being gained and lateral movement gives you a little bit more opportunity to be able to do that. So I'd love to see some play action rollouts, moving pockets, some speed outs, things like that, to be able to create a little bit more for this offense. I think that would go a long way. And you see that a lot with the Baltimore Ravens. You see it a lot with several teams, the Miami Dolphins, the Philadelphia Eagles, all that. Speaking of the Miami Dolphins, they are an offense that usually performs well, but did not perform well on Sunday Night Football against a very, very stout Philadelphia Eagles defense. Dolphins averages 3.8 yards per carry on the ground during this game. The Miami Dolphins, this identity around being a run-first team with the ability of adding in all of these explosive plays. But once that rushing game got taken away, they weren't able to get anything going in terms of their passing game. Are we seeing something similar with this New Orleans Saints offense? Could this offense be performing better if they weren't averaging less than 4 yards per carry on the ground every game, and in some cases less than 3 yards per carry? So if they're able to establish a run game, then all these other things we just talked about in terms of the play action, the boot action runs, the bootlegs, the rollouts, all these other things become a little bit more effective. And now finally, looking at the Atlanta Falcons and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who played against one another in yesterday's matchups, the Atlanta Falcons end up getting that win 16-13 on the game-winning field goal. So there's a couple of things here to take a look at. The reason why I highlight this game is because that was the best possible scenario for the Saints when it came to that game. That drops the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who have played one fewer game than everybody, so their win percentage is pretty easily above everybody right now, or was. They're at 3-3 now, which gives the Saints an opportunity to be able to catch up, because if they win next week's game at 4-4 and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers lose their next game and go to 3-4, the Saints are up there above them all of a sudden. That works out as the best case scenario in that game. The thing that I would take away from that game is how important it is to have a kicker you can trust. Okay. And that doesn't mean that you have a kicker that makes 100% of its kicks, just a kicker that you can trust. So for the Saints, do they trust Blake Grupe? They need to, because it's not like you're going to go out there and find another option somewhere, right? We saw that years ago with New Orleans when Sean Payton cycled through 6 kickers in a year, if you include, Will Lutz, who was supposed to be the starter, but then had the abdominal surgery or the core surgery at that time. But how important it is to have a kicker that you can trust. Younghoe Koo knocking down that game-winning field goal. New Orleans needs to still trust Blake Grupe, because there's no better option. They're not going to go out there and find a kicker, just like you're not really going to fix your offensive line outside of maybe signing Lael Collins. But now that you've seen Cam Erving go out there and perform, you might not need to. We'll see. But the Saints have to trust their kicker. If they do, then they'll reap the benefits of that. If they don't, then the kicker loses confidence, then you never get anywhere. But you certainly can see where the Saints special teams has dug some holes for them so far. We talk about the offense a lot. The special teams unit has a lot of things that they need to get fixed over on their side as well. All right, coming up next, Was it going to be an eventful offseason for the New Orleans Saints? I think so. And I think it starts near the top. We got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, where you can make every moment yours. For instance, tonight, the San Francisco 49ers will travel to Minneapolis to take on the Vikings, and they're favored by 6.5 points on the road. Maybe that's too wide a spread for you. You like the Vikings there? Well, you can head over to FanDuel today to get started. And if you're doing so as a new customer, you're going to be able to get $200 in bonus bets by just placing a $5 bet. That's all you got to do. Guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. Then you can use those bonus bets for other things like spreads, player props, over-unders, and much more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with just a little kind of like, I've been doing a lot of preaching, I feel like, on the show, doing a lot of soapboxing and things like that. But what if nothing changes for the New Orleans Saints? They continue to struggle throughout the year. They finish, let's call it like, I don't know, 5-11. No. Sorry, that would be 5-12, 6-11, something like that, right? What do the New Orleans Saints do this offseason? Do they tear it all down and start to rebuild? Which I'm just going to tell you right now, the answer to that's no. They're not in a situation to tear anything down. And if they were to tear anything down, they're certainly not in a situation to begin to rebuild. That's going to be a commitment to a 7 to 10 year long process. Don't necessarily want to do that. I get it. But if they try to keep as much as they can intact, it opens doors for them in terms of what I imagine in that case would be a coaching search for the New Orleans Saints, right? Like if this team does not improve on offense, there's no way that Pete Carmichael is back as the offensive coordinator. And I don't want to single in on Pete Carmichael here, so let's expand the conversation. If this team goes on to win only 2 or 3 more games throughout the rest of the year, there's no shot that the Saints go back to Dennis Allen for a 3rd season. I wouldn't imagine that they would, right? Like you got the 1 year, then they gave you the quarterback and your coaching staff for a 2nd year, and then that's kind of it. Like if you can't get that done, the NFL moves that quickly, right? NFL teams, NFL franchises, they want to win. They want to sell tickets. They want to give their community, their fan base the best possible product. And if you put together a 7-10 season, and then you follow that up with a 5-12, a 6-11 season, then you're probably done, right? Like you're probably toast. That would be 3 years in a row that the Saints don't make the playoffs. That's pretty unacceptable for this standard. Do I think that the Saints would maintain Derek Carr as their starting quarterback? Absolutely. I think you're kind of married to him for the rest of this year and for next year. And you'd probably want to see, okay, well, could Derek Carr be the guy or be a guy if the offensive system worked and if the offensive system wasn't unimaginative and stale and if it wasn't, those things. And if you brought somebody in that maybe updated it like a Brian Johnson or an Eric Bieniemy or something like that comes in and then creates an offense that caters to all of your team. How does that impact your starting quarterback at that point? So there's a lot of different ways that the Saints could go with all of this, but I do expect that if this team doesn't make the playoffs this year, which has solely been the expectation of the organization, is to make the playoffs, win the division, make the playoffs. That has been the goal this whole offseason. Everything that they've done so far leading up to this year was to put them there. And they're not far off the pace to be able to do that, right? They could still have that happen. I might still ask questions about the coaching staff, even if they make the playoffs. But certainly if they don't, it makes sense, right? Like this isn't even just me trying to be ugly or be gross or talk about somebody else's job or anything like that. Like it's just a logical thing that would make sense where that would happen. And then everybody that covers the NFL would go, okay. Like, yeah, they didn't make the playoffs. They missed it again. They had everything that they felt like they needed and they still didn't do it. So they needed to make a change somewhere. That makes sense. So I could certainly see the Saints making those big changes if things don't shape up, right? If things don't end up getting them into that playoff, getting them into the playoffs, getting them into that 10-win conversation. But either way, I think the New Orleans Saints need to seriously take a look at their offensive line going into next year. And whether that's looking at the depth or whether it's potentially looking at starters, because you're probably going to have at least one starter position to fill anyway. They accelerated the end of Andrews Pete's contract to after this season, before this year. So he's going to be a free agent at the end of the season. I don't imagine that the Saints are going to be bringing him back. So do you go out there and you look for a new starting left guard, whether that be in the NFL or trying to draft one? Do you feel good about Nick Saldiveri stepping up into that role, and then so therefore you're looking at depth and maybe you want some veteran experience? You try to retain James Hurst. What do you do with Trevor Penning? Do you give up on him after effectively 1 year? I don't think so. I think the Saints would still roll there, but do you draft some competition for him? Could make sense. Could make sense, especially if you can draft some competition for him that's also got right tackle versatility. Then you've got yourself your potential future starter at either spot, and you have a backup behind Ryan Ramczyk, who, let's just face it, you need to have a backup for, right? Because he deals with a lot. And so I think you look at the offensive line as kind of one of the biggest places where the Saints can use some help. The other place is on the defensive line. The Saints need some pass rush. And like the pass rush just hasn't been a pass rush that gets started early in the season. It's usually a pass rush that catches its rhythm through the middle of the season. You'd like to see that change. So even if that's just adding a specialist, doesn't mean replacing anybody, but even if that's just adding somebody that you throw in on third down that goes along with your Carl Granderson and your Cam Jordan and your Brian Brzee, and you get that third defensive end that comes in on that NASCAR package, kind of like what Tano Passanio does right now, and then just adds some juice, I think there's value in that. Or even if you want to keep Cam on the field for your first and second downs, but then in those NASCAR packages, throw out the young, speed rusher, which I think the Saints desperately need on their defensive line, which would probably come with a coaching change, right? Like that prototype might change a little bit in that case. I think that could make sense. But the Saints need speed on their defensive line. They have a lot of these like big, strong guys that can outlast an offensive lineman should a quarterback be forced to hold on to the ball for long enough. But they're not a defensive line that consistently, right? We see it every now and then. Carl Granderson's had some quick wins this season, but consistently, they're not a defensive line that wins within, 2.5, 3 seconds. That's probably not really the right. Let's call it 3.5, 4 seconds, right? So you don't see a lot of these quick wins by the New Orleans Saints defensive line. You see a lot of quick wins against New Orleans Saints offensive line, however. So I think that could be a place that could make some sense. And then outside of that, the next thing that you're looking for is probably going to be like the linebacker, right? Can you find another young linebacker that can come in and be ready behind Pete Werner and Demario Davis, but that can also contribute on special teams? They have these guys that can contribute on special teams like Zach Bond, DeMarco Jackson, some of these others, but aren't necessarily guys that you trust to be starters as your middle linebacker. Then you have a guy like Jalen Smith, who you trust to be a starter at your middle linebacker, your will linebacker, but doesn't contribute on special teams. So finding that guy could make a lot of sense. And then the last thing that I'll mention here is, do you go out and try to grab a rookie quarterback again? I mean, Jake Haener, they drafted last year, but if you go into next season and you go, okay, well, there's this fantastic crop of quarterbacks that are going to be out there. Jayden Daniels, Shedeur Sanders, you can go even further down the list, and then you could find some of these other younger guys from around the NCAA without having to go to the top guys like Caleb Williams and Michael Penix and Drake May and all that. Like, there's this second sort of tier of quarterbacks. It's still really, really good quarterbacks that would be challenging guys like CJ Stroud and Bryce Young for QB1 this year, right? This past year. Or maybe more likely actually would have been challenging guys like Kenny Pickett and Desmond Ridder and Malik Willis as QB1s that year. Let me actually, I think that's probably more appropriate. But do you draft a young quarterback to sit behind Derek Carr, or are you comfortable with Jake Haener? And does that change depending upon if there's coaching changes? Yes, 100% it changes if there's coaching changes and things like that. So that could be a really interesting thing to look at too. And that's not a guy that you bring in to immediately take Derek Carr's job next year, but it's a guy that you bring in to learn behind Derek Carr for a year or two and then see if maybe that's somebody you turn to after the contract is done with Derek Carr, or if it's not, you re-sign Derek Carr and then you continue to roll with what that is. So it could be a very eventful offseason for the New Orleans Saints. And I would almost say that like some of these things, like the offensive line, defensive line, finding that linebacker depth and that rookie quarterback question, I think all of those questions exist whether or not this team makes the playoffs. The thing that doesn't, the conversation that would kind of shift is going to be the head coach conversation, making the playoffs or not. And then the offensive coordinator conversation, I think, is going to be a decision that they have to make one way or another. So it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see. And that's one of the reasons why I love covering this kind of a season that's kind of tumultuous. And, that I come here and I still have like a smile on my face and joy and all these other things, is because like these are the storylines that build. These are the things that lay the foundation for those big time offseason conversations. So we'll see. Can the New Orleans Saints hold some of those conversations at bay, or will those conversations be welcome conversations by season's end? That's what we're going to be looking for all throughout the rest of the season. Appreciate everybody here, all of y'all, for making us your first listen of the day every day. Thank you to all the everydayers out there. Coming up on tomorrow's episode, film notes, bringing you together. We're going to bringing all of those together, and then kind of going into what went wrong, what went right for the New Orleans Saints after we really dig into the tape. So we got that coming up for you on tomorrow's Tuesday episode here on Locked On Saints. Thank you very much, as always, making Locked On Saints a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. And as always, if you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.